Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Our apologies for having started a bit late. We experienced some technical glitches which we are trying to deal with now. But all the same, you are most welcome. My name is Peter Seto. I'm the Chief Executive of Vumelana Advisory Fund, and I will be facilitating this session. Vumelana is a non-profit public benefit organization that was established in 2012 to support South Africa's land reform program. We support the establishment of viable partnerships between investors on the one hand and beneficiaries of land reform program. We have as one of our objectives to promote and demonstrate the value of partnerships as a contributor to successful land reform. Just to get some of the house rules out of the way, please submit all questions and clarifications via the chat spaces. This is the only platform that we have for engagement. When you do submit your question, you are kindly requested to make a note of who you want to direct your question to amongst the panelists. We will direct the question to the appropriate panelist. Please feel free to share and retweet on social media. We would like to get as much traction around today's discussion as much as possible. The hashtags for today's discussions are hashtag land reform and hashtag crunch time land reform. This will be posted on the chat. I would like to really take this opportunity to welcome you all to this webinar hosted by Vumelana and Mail and Guardian, and we hope to get your reflections and divergent views from both yourselves and members of the panel who are experts in their own right. Land reform has moved up the political agenda over the past few years and is bound to even be more pronounced in the coming months. We have further witnessed an increase in divergent views and sometimes, unfortunately, rhetoric in pressing ahead with policy and legislative changes. On the 1st of October this year, the Minister of Agriculture, Mayor Tokodidiza, announced that about 700,000 hectares of underutilized and vacant state land will be released for redistribution. On the 9th of October 2020, the Department of Public Works gazetted the Land Expropriation Bill, which sets out the rules by which government can lay claim to land in public interest and public purpose. In the same week, the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee, which has been established to amend the Constitution to allow for land expropriation, announced its intention to proceed with public hearings, which started again in October. What remains worrying, however, is the fact that it is believed that between 70 and 90% of land reform projects have been unsuccessful, leaving, therefore, vast amounts of arable land underutilized or vacant. So where from here? Some of the questions that ordinary South Africans have been asking themselves: what do all these developments actually mean for ordinary South Africans? What are the future implications? Who is affected? Will the proposed measures contribute towards improved livelihoods of people? What is the impact of a partnership-driven model driven through community-private partnership? As the government is running out of funds to support land reform efforts, does land reform still present opportunities for the private sector, driven partnerships and investment? Will we meet our targets in terms of the National Development Plan, or will South Africa become another failed land reform case study? To respond to this and other questions, I am joined by an esteemed panel who are experts in their own right and continue to play an invaluable role in land reform more broadly. As part of the panel, I have Dr. Matole Motshega, who really doesn't require any introduction. He's chairing the ad hoc committee that has been formed to initiate and introduce legislation amending Section 25. I also have Bulelwa Mabasa, who's the Director and Head of Land Restitution. advertisement attorneys. Her expertise is spread across a number of practice areas, which include dispute resolution, infrastructure, energy, mining, etc. Her areas of specialization include administrative law, constitutional law, commercial law, expropriation, litigation, etc. She has served on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. And we also have Wandile, who's the Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. He is an agricultural economist by training. He was appointed as a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council in 2019, after serving on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture between 2018 and 2019. He's also a member of the Council of Statistics of South Africa, Stats SA. He's a commissioner at the International Trade Commission of South Africa. We also have Mazwi. Mazwi is the programs manager at Vumelana Advisory Fund. He's really the engine behind what we do at Vumelana. He joins Vumelana in 2013 to manage the core programs of the fund, which is Transactional Advisory Support Program and the Communal Institutional Support Program. It is a role where he procures and manages advisory services for the structuring of agreements between communal property institutions and commercial investors. He has 20 years experience in managing social development interventions in multidisciplinary settings. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you as panel members. Now, just to get the ball rolling, I'm going to start with Dr. Matole Motshekga, just to raise a few questions so that you can have some introductory remarks. During the 5th Parliament, the Constitutional Review Committee was mandated to solicit views of the public on the possible review of Section 25 of the Constitution. After extensive consultation, the Review Committee recommended that Section 25 of the Constitution be amended to make it explicit, or to make explicit rather, that which is implicit in the Constitution with regard to expropriation of land without compensation as a legitimate option for land reform, and so as to really address the wrongs of the past. A resolution supporting this was passed in the National Assembly during the 5th Parliament and again in the 6th Parliament, which resulted in the development of the Constitution 8th Amendment Bill of 2019. Dr. Motshekga, for the benefit of participants, can you briefly explain where we are with this process? What are the timelines? When can we realistically expect to have finality on this matter? And probably how this bill was promulgated will impact positively on land reform. Over to you, Dr.
Perhaps I should say that it's very difficult to speak on behalf of a multi-party committee with divergent views, and I may be accused of misrepresenting other parties that sit in the committee, and therefore I should say I'm a professor of law at UNISA and a professor of law at Nelson Mandela University. So if I happen to express an opinion which is you cannot attribute to Parliament, then attribute it to my professorship. What has happened is that we had to reach a compromise in the ad hoc committee because for us to start the public hearings, we had to have a text that all political parties were happy with. And in that text, we agreed that we are going to make explicit what is implicit in the Constitution. Now, we started the public hearings on that basis. But you have to bear in mind that that was a deal among politicians who were trying to accommodate one another. But when we went to the people, other issues arose, and those issues will be contained in the report that will be submitted to the ad hoc committee this week. But I'm pleased to say that the public hearings went very well until we were interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ad hoc committee was stopped, but it was revived again. We started in October, as you correctly said, and now we have completed the public hearings. We are awaiting the final report. The committee will be sitting this week to hear what has come out from the people. And that report, if it's, and I guess it will be accepted by all political parties, then it will be tabled in the National Assembly for consideration. And then the National Assembly will come up with the way forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutsaka, for those opening remarks and really for giving us information on where we are with this process of amending Section 25. I would like to now move over to Bulelwa so that she can also give us introductory remarks. Bulelwa, the Land Expropriation Bill was gazetted by the Department of Public Works on the 9th of October 2020. The bill sets out the rules by which the government can lay claim to the land in public interest and for public purpose. Can you really share with the participants what does this really mean for land reform as we look ahead? Where are the gaps and what needs to be done to ensure that land reform efforts from here on are successful? How will another failed land reform program really impact the country in the next 10 years? Over to you, Bulelwa. Excuse me, Bulelwa?
Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you now. Won't you start, because we missed the first part? If you can just start, I'm sorry. Sorry, Bulelwa, we can't hear you now. Can anybody? Sure. We can't hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can. Hey.
Okay. My apologies for the endless technical glitches that I'm going through this morning. But thankfully to the panel members for being resourceful. I have connected through another device. My apologies again. I think it's important to place the concept of expropriation under the land reform discussion into context. Land reform as a program is not limited to expropriation. The land reform program in South Africa is divided into 3 pillars. The one is that there's a program that allows land claimants to submit claims when they can show that they were dispossessed of land, and they are then entitled to land or payments of compensation where it has been proven that they are indeed eligible for land claims. So that's restitution number 1. The second pillar of land reform is redistribution. In terms of this constitution, Section 25(7) tells us that the state must take legislative and other measures to ensure that there is redistribution of land on an equitable basis. Now, this redistribution program is what has probably been the least, the one that has not resulted in adequate legislative intervention. another missing pillar which should form part of registration is land administration. Land administration would be a process under which all state departments and government creates a system where it is known who owns South Africa, where they own South Africa, and everybody has access to all of that. Then the fourth pillar which exists is on land security of tenure. And this is to ensure that vulnerable people, such as farm workers and farm dwellers, are able to not be evicted arbitrarily. I say this because it's important to frame the discussion around land reform, understanding that there are at least 4 pillars that formulated. On the question of expropriation, I think it's important that I also clarify that an expropriation is a globally available tool to governments to be able to obtain land that is needed for the public good and the public purpose. It is only a tool that allows government to acquire that land. So expropriation and land reform are not interchangeable concepts. Expropriation, as I said, is a worldwide global tool. However, in South Africa, the current legislation on expropriation is the 1975 Act, which was drafted on the basis that the state would acquire land on a market basis, willing buyer, willing seller. That Expropriation Act did not take into account that one day South Africa will have to be faced with the challenge of reforming, redistributing land post-colonialism. So the concept of expropriation is borrowed from Roman Dutch law, from English law. It is not designed inherently to be a tool that helps land reform. The crafters and the inventors of expropriation were solving their own problems. They were solving the problem that if a state wants to buy land to build a train or to build a school, it must do so, but then it would pay the person who suffers adequate compensation for it. So it's important to understand the definitional and the positional value of expropriation and what it means. Now, when we move to South Africa, we have to ask ourselves, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Bulelo. Please proceed.
Yes.
So when we start saying in South Africa, 26 years after democracy, when we ask why is expropriation important and what is its role? What is the role of expropriation in South Africa? The first answer is we must understand its origins, what it was designed for and by whom. Secondly, if we are then to want to make expropriation fit for purpose for South Africa, the reality in South Africa is that when the mass dispossession that happened in our society happened, it didn't happen through legal means. It didn't happen through means where there was always compensation. So now we are trying to redesign expropriation to be fit for South Africa's needs. What that means is that we have to bring it within the tune, within the Constitution itself. And Section 25 of the Constitution and Section 25(3) makes it very plain that, and this is, I'm not talking about the Constitution prior to the suggested amendments. Section 25 of our Constitution, unsurprisingly, says that when expropriation happens, there must be payment of compensation. So you cannot eradicate compensation completely from the current framing. However, it does say, it does implicit within it, tell us that there are factors that must be taken into account when calculating compensation, and that it is not only market value. It says to us, how was this land acquired? It says to us, was the state direct investment? It says to us, were there improvements on the land? And what was the purpose of the initial dispossession? So We now have a conundrum where we've got a 1975 Expropriation Act that was not changed since 1975 up until now, where we're now sitting with a bill. And the conundrum that we sit in is because throughout the existence of the Constitution, and although the Constitution has told us that expropriation can happen at less than market value, we have created a precedent and policies that have favored or have been implemented on the basis of the market. So where we are right now is that we are sitting with a bill that is attempting to put itself in line with the Constitution. And at the same time, whilst we're doing that, there has been no conclusion, or even there's been no conclusion on the wording of the attempted amendment to Section 25. The attempted amendment to Section 25 is to enable zero compensation to happen, because at the moment, our Constitution expects compensation to happen, yet we are, so at the moment, the Constitution expects payment of compensation. Yes, it can be less than market, but the argument that I've made, and I think that comes out from the Land Reform Panel report, which has sat on, is that unfortunately it does not make it possible to have no compensation at all. So that's where we are in terms of expropriation. But I think it's also important to say this: we can solve the expropriation problem. In other words, we can enable the states to purchase land at very drastically less than market value, but that alone will never be the magic bullet. Why? Because we have to look at the land reform program in its entirety. You cannot focus attention only on the issue of how the state acquires the land and the property. The most important thing is that the land reform program in South Africa is still based on the South African policy on land reform of 1996. It is no longer fit for purpose. We now need to go back to the drawing board and design a national vision for land that will breathe life into those 4 pillars that I started my discussion with. In other words, how are we going to make sure that restitution actually works? How are we going to make sure that when people are given land, they are empowered enough to ensure that that land is sustainable? When you talk about redistribution, for example, redistribution, I did say you don't need to show that you were dispossessed of land. When redistribution happens, what legislation is going to inform redistribution? I see that the Department of Land Reform issued an advertisement to invite people to respond on the release of agricultural land, which is to be commended. However, we're still sitting with legislation such as the Provisional of Assistance Act that is archaic, that is still devoid of constitutional relevance, because it does not give people, there is no transparency in terms of who is given, where is that land given, and what are the purposes for that is being given. Then we need to start the administration issues. We still don't know in South Africa who owns what land and where and the extent of it. That means there's going to be a uniform and very intentional ways in which how land administration happens in South Africa is done. And within this issue of land administration, panel members, is the very real issue of the fact that 80% of South Africans fall outside of the formal administration of land. In other words, they are not accounted for. They are not accounted for in the deeds registry. They do not have a legal system that recognizes them as landowners or land occupiers. And land administration is something that is going to assist, in my view, in that process. When we talk about tenure insecurity or tenure security, we've seen that even during the lockdown, many publicized cases of communities and occupiers that are still being evicted, even though we're in the height of the lockdown. So without dominating the space, and I think I've answered some of the questions. Please do call me to order if there's an outstanding question that I didn't answer. But my parting shot from this segment is that when we think of land reform, we must ask us the question: all of these three pillars and one pillar that is still missing that make up our land reform program. Okay. Where do we need to be live in order to ensure that all of this happens? Expropriation is one tool, but expropriation is not going to be where it's not going to be the ultimate resolution to the issue. Lastly, we need to put paid to the slogan that land reform is significant. We cannot continue to have the land reform project that is not resourced enough to ensure that all the institutions in it, such as the land, the Commission on Restitution of Land Rights, which is such a critical institution that actually has the mandate to sort out a lot of these issues, that it's not properly resourced. So there's got to be an equal amount of resourcing to the land reform program if we have to attach political will to it. And so far, I am not convinced that we have elevated land reform and positioned it politically to occupy the prominence that it should in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulela, for those elaborate words. And I'm going to now go to Wandile. Wandile, it has been reported that to date, between 70 and 90% of land reform projects have been successful. Now we have a situation where an additional 700,000 hectares of underutilized land or vacant land will be redistributed. Can you really share with us your thoughts on what does this mean for ordinary South Africans and the future of South Africa's land reform in general? And what is the impact on food security and on food production? Will this solve the problems that we have in the land reform space? And if not, why? Over to you, Adile.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'm gonna have to answer in a couple of ways, perhaps maybe in 2 points. I could pick off from one of the important points that Bulelwa made, which is the point on the land ownership and land administration in general. And perhaps I will also comment on as a second point on a critique on that 700,000 hectares that you mentioned. I think as a starting, Peter, in South Africa, there is a general narrative that land reform has been slow. And the figure that is typically quoted is that 9% that is going around to say it's only 9% of the land that is owned by black folks and stuff. But that speaks to the point that Bulelo was touched on, to say, firstly, we really need to deal with the issues around land administration. But also on that point, I would like to also push back a little bit, because as agricultural economists general in South Africa, I think people have always looked at those statistics with some level of suspicion that actually land reform has been much more faster than what is typically reported. And the number of data that is coming out from the University of Stellenbosch and elsewhere is really showing that perhaps maybe the number that we should be using is somewhere at a range between 17% and around about 21%. So there has been generally a bit of a progress. And that, Peter, links back to the point that you were answering, because the state has to a certain extent been good at acquiring some of these land parcels, but where the failure has been on transferring those land, but after it has been transferred, to actually see it being productive and improve the people's living standards in those areas that it has been transferred on. And part of that story then links back to the 700 1,000 hectares on, because I think that on its own, at a more broader level, it is a positive thing, because it means that the state is beginning to release some of the land supply that it has been sitting on, which again accumulates to those percentages that I was mentioning in them. But the key challenge for me when I look at that 700,000 hectares as a first point is really that I would have liked to see that once people are given the leases to practice on those pieces of land, they thereafter maybe get an option to begin to buy that land, either after 5 years or so, but not have to wait for a lifetime of 30 years before they are actually able to begin buying those lands. So any rent after 5 years, and this is a point that we made in an essay with Professor Johan Kirsten, to say after 5 years, you have to begin now any payment of rent to really accumulate towards the purchase of that piece of land. And also, you know that all of those 700 hectares are vacant lands. There are already some people that are sitting there. And I do think that the positive message which has been coming out of government is to say they are doing this, but they won't be removing the people that are sitting in those land, but it will assist them, again, to the land administration question on knowing who's where and what are they doing and how did they begin to actually acquire those parcels of land. But at the core, on addressing the failure at which you were pointing on, I do think that for me, one of the important aspects will be pushing strongly these aspects of the joint venture approach. Because some of the key things where you can say what is leading to the failures of land reform, one of them might be the access to capital, but also another issue is the issue around the skills levels, but also interlinkages to existing value chains, market opportunities for the produce after it has gotten in. So a number of those, and obviously at the core, the selection of the beneficiaries. And this is another point that came from Bulelwa, to say, how do we know who benefits from what? And I do think that from the work that she and I were part of on the panel, there was a proposal there to put the land reform beneficiary selection criteria, and there is already a policy in place which government is working on to make sure that there is some bit of transparency onto that, and also a targeted approach on who really gets benefit on redistributional side of land reform. So I think and also making sure that you lean on existing skills within agribusinesses and farmer organization for that joint venture approach type of system, but also on some of the land that you do transfer, you allow people some tradable leases so that they can be able to tap on some capital to make sure that land is used productively, will be one of the useful things when we begin to deal with the land reform story. But Peter, I will stop there with these remarks and wait for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wandile. Now I want to move over to Mazwi. Colleagues, I know that we're running, we started a bit late and we're chasing time because we've got 1 hour really for this engagement. Mazwi, your views, as we look ahead, it's clear that there are no additional funds to be spent on land reform. We know that recently the Minister of Finance was at pains to actually indicate to the rest of us as South Africans that there is no money, and in fact there are budget cuts in several respects. In fact, as indicated earlier, we are facing budget cuts in land reform, as I've said. The question is, what is the role of partnerships? Do they really present an opportunity to bridge the funding gap in land reform, or will they be fueling tensions? What has been the experience of Vumela now creating partnerships between land reform by beneficiaries and private investors? Over to you, Masu.
Thank you, Peter, and greetings to fellow panelists and our audience. Peter, the importance of partnerships cannot be overemphasized. Partnerships which bring in private capital to complement state resourcing. As we have heard from the previous speakers, what the state is able to do is quite limited in terms of covering the whole ambit of the land reform needs. What the state already is able to do in terms of acquiring land for land reform purposes is quite a significant use of resources already. So it is important then therefore to look at private capital so that we can leverage resources, information, skills, the networks of established business firms so that we can use those linkages to connect land reform beneficiaries to opportunities of success. The view that we take from Vumelana is one where, and I know that we've covered quite a number of points here around the objective of land reform, but the view that we take as Vumelana in view of land reform is one where we realize the importance of transferred land as a pathway out of poverty. Not only that, but also as an enabler of bringing new land reform beneficiaries into the mainstream economy. So it's very important that we leverage the goodwill as well as the intentional commitment that we continue to see in our various operations, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in tourism. What one finds is that there's quite a lot of goodwill and engagement at various levels where the established operators are keen to bring into their value chains and their operations those that are beneficiaries of land reform. This contribution is important, Peter, in a way that what it does is that it prevents communities from losing on an opportunity that has been extended to have an asset. To have an asset and not be able to work it or make it generate the kind of positive impact that you'd like to see is quite frustrating. And so this is also where we also come with the view that says that as much as there's a slow pace in terms of the land reform program, there should be a greater focus also, just in terms of ensuring that where land has already exchanged hands and it's now resting with new landowners, more should be done, therefore, to make sure that that land is kept productive or is brought to productive use. Because remember, the interventions that we find ourselves in that are linked to land reform, these really become the local economic drivers in those communities, where often we know of the challenges of high levels of unemployment, and poverty and inequality and so forth. So, Peter, with those ways, I mean, it's just emphasizing the importance and the contribution of partnerships as positive contributors to land reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Bazui. And perhaps maybe let me go back to Ntate Motshekga. Ntate Motshekga, when one looks at the preamble to the draft amendment bill, it suggests that expropriation without compensation will serve to accelerate the land reform process. But a number of researchers and reports, such as the high-level panel report, which is often referred to as the Motlanthe report, pointed out that the Constitution is not the main impediment to successful land reform, but that other factors, such as lack of post-settlement support, inadequate budgets and access to finance, lack of government capacity, poor coordination, and corruption, to mention a few, are really at the core of the problem. What is your take on this, Ntate
Motshekga? I think we must understand the situation in its historical context. And this is what we picked up as we moved around the country. That, beginning in 1652, the Khoi and San in particular were forcibly dispossessed of their land. And even today, they remain the most affected people. Now, in 1885, the Berlin Conference carved our country and distributed it amongst the Europeans. Now, in 1909, the South Africa Act was passed, and which established the Union. And now, in 1913, only 7% of the total surface of the country was left to the majority, which was increased to 13% in 1936. And now this 13% became the native reserves. Therefore, it means that African people don't have access to land. And when we do public hearings, we find that throughout the country, you either have townships which were labor reservoirs, or you have informal settlements. Now, the question is, how do you make land accessible to all the people of South Africa? And there's actually no other mechanism except that government must have the authority and the capacity to expropriate the land and redistribute it to all who want to work on the land. We understand that there's a process of restitution, but that process of restitution has been very, very slow. And we also established a bureaucracy, the National Land Claims Commission with the Regional Land Claims Commission, and to maintain those structures is very costly. So corruption is something that is also related to this bureaucracy that we have established. I think our point of departure should simply be that the majority of South Africans live in the native reserves. And these native reserves include the townships. So the land, as the Freedom Charter says, has got to belong to all the people of South Africa. And there's no other mechanism that you can use to make the land belong to all the people of South Africa except by expropriating land. Because, when you drive throughout the country, vast tracts of land are unoccupied, unutilized, and African people are still in townships, they are still in informal settlements. There is a great land hunger. Now, when you talk about partnerships, you cannot enter into a partnership with a person from a squatter camp. Land must first be made available, and therefore the logical approach is that we must expropriate land without compensation, and the state must then redistribute the land that is there to South Africans. And those who can prove that they were forcibly dispossessed of the land, they must be given their land. There must be post-settlement support. But if you say people must form partnerships, then the private sector will put their money, and after they've put their money, what is there for them? Which means that the owners of the land will end up being indebted to the partners. So I think the first step is I would suggest let's all support land expropriation without compensation, and deal with the question as to how do we redistribute the land that we have expropriated to make land accessible to all South Africans. Poor coordination and corruption, those things are the byproducts of the situation that we have now.
Thank you, Ndade Masaka, for your take and your views on this one. Perhaps in the context of COVID-19, weak economy, joblessness that we've been subjected to as a country, we have seen bold responses by government to really mitigate the crisis through initiatives such as the increase in welfare payments, but perhaps with a less focus on land reform. Do you think land reform can contribute towards rejuvenating our economy and job creation? and perhaps as a related question, can redistributive land reform be undertaken in a manner that creates jobs? And if so, which commodity mixes, or for that matter, farming systems should we be focusing on, and perhaps at what scale?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. But I want to start, Peter, by pushing off to what Dr. Masecha was saying. I think the idea that there's a vast stretch of land across the Republic that is underutilized might perhaps be pushing it a bit too far. I mean, if you look at South Africa on the land uses of the country, you are a country that is about 122 million hectares. Agriculture is taking what, 77, 78 million hectares of that. And if you look at what is being used there, a large part of it, more than 2/3, is on livestock. Yes, when you're driving across the country, it will look like areas are really underutilized, but there's livestock farming in there. But also, I think into that point, we have to think about also the people's willingness to move to some of these areas that we do see when you drive around the country. But I think the point that there's lots of land out there that is not used in the country, statistics and evidence is not supporting that view. As to whether then land reform will contribute to growth as we recover from COVID-19, I think obviously as long as there could be agricultural activity that is productive, and for agricultural activity to be productive, Peter, it will need some level of investments to actually come through in the sector. And obviously once that investment is in there, is about having that land being used productively at whatever the stage that is it. So I do think that for me, the first step of that 700,000 hectares in the near term, it is what can assist. But long run and looking at where we're going, I think you have to think about land reform from an agricultural perspective in the context of other programs that are being done. Either it's a master plan or whatever program, you have to think about it in that sort of way. But I think the underpinning point that we should always remember is that South Africa's agriculture is capital intensive. For money to come in then as a flow, as investments, there are certain prerequisites that needs to be in place. But I do take the point of the land hunger in the urban area side. And Bulelwa has written and talked about this personally when we were doing the land reform panel report about the issues to address the urban issues. But I do think that when we think about agriculture in general in South Africa, we have to be cognizant of what is required to get agriculture to be productive for jobs thereafter to flow through in the sector. This is an industry where you have invested, for example, as we speak, roughly 200 billion rands of debt that is held by the agricultural sector. And any further expansion requires money. That money to get in and that productivity to happen and those long-term crops that create jobs is horticulture, which is very expensive to establish. And so I think those are some of the aspects that we really need to think about them more comprehensively when we think about the jobs, economic growth, as well as the restorative justice question, because we're dealing with two goals here, a restorative justice question, as well as the economic growth and job creation question. And I think that you need to be careful about how you balance those. We cannot be careless about how we deal with the South African economy and the way they approach it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wandile. And before I go to Bulelo Mazwi, Ndadamo Sekwa earlier on expressed his misgivings, or rather his reservations about partnerships, that his fear is that the owners will end up being indebted to investors in these partnerships. Would you mind quickly sharing with the participants panel what has been the key lessons that you have learned as Fumelana, seeing that you are really about partnerships? And what is it that's required to make this a success? Do you really want to? Can you make some comments on that?
Yes, thanks, Peter. And to Ramatsacha's point, and I see also that Xolani Khatebe has a similar kind of a comment on our chat. The way in which we see the importance of partnerships and how we've approached it as Vumelana is by way of providing transaction advisors that can be able to mediate and make the facilitation of these partnerships between land reform beneficiaries and private investors possible. The importance of transaction advisors goes to the heart of what Ramotsecha is highlighting, which is basically to make sure that whatever agreements that are established between the land reform beneficiaries and commercial investors, those agreements must be based on transparent and mutually beneficial terms. So it is the work of our transaction advisors in the 21 deals that we've successfully facilitated, which are capable of raising just over 730 million rands in new investment. It is the work of the transaction advisors that makes it possible for fair and equitable agreements to be reached between land reform beneficiaries and their commercial partners. Sorry, Peter, am I missing something else? So, okay, just to add. So part of the critical lessons that we, we have experienced include the importance of the centrality of government. Whether we're facilitating deals towards agreements or whether we get to the stage of implementation, the role of government continues to be quite central to the success of the work that we do. The other point that I may quickly raise has to do with the fact that not all land reform land carries a developmental potential. So what this also means for us then is just to be clear and be sure that we can manage expectations quite early on as we take on opportunities that get presented to us. The last point, if I may just quickly add it, Peter, is the importance here of governance and financial management support that should be provided to enable these large assets owning communities to be able to implement our commercial partnerships with success. It cannot go unsupported. The point where land reform communities take a central stage in commercial operations, but without there being, the requisite level of governance, so that reporting to members can be maintained. Transparency in terms of financial reporting should also be maintained. Without those ingredients, we fall into the usual trap of ongoing community conflicts. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Mazwi. I've got a number of questions coming from the participants. I'm not gonna. Some of the stuff is actually really comments, not so much questions. But Tate Motseka, I just want to read something here so that you can try to internalize it whilst I ask Bulelwa to respond to one question. It says the 2008 cabinet decision to refuse ownership of conservation land in Kruger Park is unfair and not in the spirit of the Freedom Charter, land reform, or justice. We need to find ways to give removed communities equity in conservation. This decision must be challenged. Since when is cabinet decision now the law and not challenged? The communities do not want to change the land use only to get restorative justice and equity in the conservation economy. This was raised by one Steve Collins. Maybe just think about your views on that whilst I get Bulelwa to respond to this specific question. Bulelwa, I'm sure you've studied this bill quite extensively. In your view, just in 2 or 3 sentences or a few sentences, what are the bill's strengths and what gaps have you found in the bill? Bulelwa. Bulelwa, are you there?
I'm here, Peter. Can you please?
Sorry, I can't hear you. I missed you.
I'm saying, can you please repeat the question? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I'm saying I realize that you have probably studied the bill quite extensively. I'm talking about the land expropriation bill. So I want to find out, in your view, what are the bill's strengths and what gaps have you found in the bill?
Sure. Thank you, Peter. I think the one fundamental issue to point out is that from a constitutional basis, it would have been proper to first have the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution to be finalized because that amendment and the wording of the amendment in Section 25 should be what informs the content of the bill. So that's just the procedural constitutional issue that I'd like to flag out there, is that you would have expected that the amendment of the Constitution is what should inform what happens in secondary legislation. And that is a legal issue of the principle of subsidiarity. But be that as it may, I think that the one issue that is positive about the bill is that suddenly the question of expropriation without compensation is no longer a monster that no one wants to talk about or that no one wants to interact with. It does clarify, and it does seek to clarify those circumstances that would warrant zero compensation. Because in the past, when you mentioned expropriation without compensation, there was a tendency to think that what is being said is that land will be nationalized or that if there would be land grabs. But I think it provides a certain sense of certainty around the fact that the rule of law will be what governs expropriation, number one. That's a positive. As I said, the second positive is that it does give you those instances that would warrant expropriation without compensation. But obviously, as you would have it, every time you list things that are allowable, questions will arise about other instances that might not be listed in the legislation. And I think another issue around the expropriation bill as a whole is that we need to realize that expropriation without compensation, I would like to disagree with Professor Mochega on the basis of the following. Those circumstances are so limited that even if you were to do expropriation without compensation, let's say for abandoned buildings or whatever, the fact of the matter is that there is no sufficient land that is available that will restore the people of South Africa, especially the dispossessed, to where they were. In other words, not even expropriation is going to, on its own, end up with land reform patterns being reformed drastically, especially because the expropriation bill does not deal with, for example, the reality of the fact that, as Wandile has said, that the agricultural production principles inherent in them have so many factors that need to be taken into account. Security of tenure. Are you able to, is the land registered? Who does the land belong to? Are they leases? Are they tradable? So all of those issues are not going to be solved by expropriation without compensation. The issue around land hunger in the urban areas, we know that the Western Cape, Gauteng, the cities with a lot of density, expropriation without compensation is not going to solve that problem, because you're not going to uproot all these people that are, either in the suburbs or in the city centers or because land there is already settled. It's people that are already there. So expropriation without compensation is not going to unlock land which can be available to be redistributed on a mass scale in South Africa.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bulelo. You're raising some important issues which really warrant some reflection. Do you want to respond?
I agree with Bulelo.
Yeah, sorry.
I want to agree with Bulelo when he says. I want to agree with her when she says, actually, the amendment of the Constitution should have come first to inform the expropriation bill in line with the principle of subsidiarity. But you see, when she says the expropriation bill does not deal with circumstances, deal with the land and things like that, the aim of the expropriation bill is to create a framework in terms of which the bill must be crafted. I think we've put the horse before the cart. That's where the problem is. But I don't agree that there is no sufficient land. The public hearings have given us an opportunity to travel throughout South Africa. There is sufficient land, and African people are actually still living in reserves, either as townships or as informal settlements. I think that I'm happy we have experts like the ones who have assembled here, who have statistics, who knows which land is where. But you see, if we are going to emphasize food security, and you ask yourself, who is producing food for who? More of these people who are producing this food, they produce it for export, and the local people still have nothing to eat. And what we have been told, people say it is us who work the land. We can produce food for ourselves. We don't want to be fed like pigs. So that's why I'm saying let's lower the temperatures and just agree that I agree that in the urban areas there could be challenges, but out there, if you travel to Limpopo, when you pass Hammanskraal, land is free right up to Polokwane. If you go to KZN, land is free until you get to Harrismith. If you travel from Kimberley, land is free until you get to Uppington. There's enough land for all South Africans to share. So I think I would suggest that maybe we await the report that we will table in Parliament this week. You will see that there is enough land for all of us, and then we can debate on the basis of evidence. But at the moment, I think we are looking more in terms of, security of tenure, in terms of the sufficiency of land and other things, not informed by the evidence that we gathered during the public hearings.
Okay. Dr. Motshekga, perhaps maybe just to respond to the issues that was raised around the 2008 cabinet decision to refuse ownership of conservation land in the Kruger Park. Do you want to respond to that?
You see, yes, I think cabinet decisions should be reviewable, because, for instance, you have the Makuleka issue. You have people who moved from Mozambique into South Africa, and they were given a place at Makuleka. If you go there, you find that there are people from former vendor who say this was our land, and they were left out. And there is a dissatisfaction there. Now, if you go to other parts of the Kruger Park, you have a place where Mtimkulu, Ngove, and the Balobedu of Mujaji are situated. But government then would go and give a piece of land to the people they found there, but who were not necessarily the owners of the land. I think some of those decisions were taken before true research could be done as to who was entitled to that land, because some of the people were even delayed in lodging the land claims. So I guess government would be amenable to reviewing some of these decisions in the light of the new information that has come to hand.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Motshekga. I've been warned that we need to wrap up, and then that I should give the speakers an opportunity to say their last bit. But I thought I must just share with you some of the stuff that part of the audience has raised. There's an email from Paul Zille. He says, Dr. Motshekga, you can have EWC or investment. You can't have both. As Mazi outlined, the only basis for sustainable land reform and land as the basis for wealth creation is community, is partnerships. The last 25 years of failed land reform reveals this beyond any doubt. Without acknowledging this reality, we are doomed to fail. That's Paul, and we've got Karabo Mashapu says over here. I'd like to find out, Dr. Motshekga, the South African government gave people land who are not ready in terms of skills. What plans do government have in order to make sure that those who will be benefiting from this land will be equipped with skills and knowledge to use the land profitably and create jobs? Comments from Francois, who says zero corruption, education, creation, and resilient citizens is what we need. He says this is what was followed by Singapore, and now it's one of the wealthiest nations. And yeah, I think we've got quite a number of comments out there. But maybe let me give this opportunity now to you as the panel members to just wrap up and make your concluding remarks. Dr. Motshekga, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Bulelwa. You can just take 2 minutes, a minute or two each.
Peter, I think Mazi has helped me to say that Vumelana has a capacity to assist communities, being mindful of the disadvantages that they can suffer. So I'm comfortable with that, because in some partnerships I've seen that people are taken for a ride. They are being reduced to servants on their own land. But I hope the services of Vumelana can be extended into the areas that I can share with you where my fears arose. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulelwa. Your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say that I agree with the issue around partnerships, but I think it's important that with partnerships that government and the overseeing institutions, such as the Commission of Restitution of Land Rights, remain on the ground in order to ensure that there is no exploitation. In my line of work, being an attorney, we have seen many cases in terms of which communities were thrust with partners that ended up almost defrauding communities. I'd like to also say that the idea that we put on the table as part of the land reform panel, which was the land donations policy, is an understanding that land reform could actually be a unifying citizenship a tool that can actually end up unifying the country if we make it possible for even people with excess land to be able to donate the land to put into the pot. I think that's an important move. And I know that there's a policy that has been started that is worked on government. I think it's positive. Secondly, I'd like to also say that we also need to look at new ways in which farming happens. Let's not underestimate the potential of urban farming and vertical farming that can happen in structures, in the townships, in cities. You look at where other cities in the world have taken farming to a different level, where it's not only land dependent. So this is a thought that I think we need to grow with. And lastly, my final shot is, let's not underestimate the importance of engaging meaningfully with communities, whether they are mining communities or communities around the seashore. Land reform ultimately belongs to the people. We need active citizenry, and we need communities to be the beneficiaries and have the loudest voices in this. It's not just an academic debate for politicians and professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulelwa. Tatewandile.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Again, Peter, I want to start on that point and say Black people are not necessarily constrained in the reserves. About 70% of them are in the cities. To the point, again, Prof was making. So just a bit of looking on that. But I do think that overall, I mean, what we would potentially be useful on a land reform side is the government also to begin firstly continuously releasing some of the land supply that they are actually having on their side. And from there onwards, build on saying what models can we learn from various firms and various organizations that have been contributing positively to the land reform side, and then try to aggregate and use those in line with other policy instruments that are available on our side. I don't think that thinking that expropriation per se somehow will resolve South Africa's land reform problems. To the point again, Bulelwa started on, this is not going to be a solution. There's a number of learnings that we can do, which you as Vumelani have some of those examples to learn from. But let's never underestimate the contribution of the social compacting that is already beginning in South Africa in a number of these things. And let's look at evidence and statistics when we are making any of these things, not so much on a political standing of where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Wandile. Mazwi, just wrap up in a second. I've been warned that I'm running a bit late.
Sure. No, thanks, Peter. My parting shot is just to emphasize the focus that we also need to place equally on the inventiveness of South Africans. There are a number of initiatives that are driving a positive story of land reform. I think that there's quite a lot of work to be done there in terms of policymakers just to be able to see and follow the insights and draw lessons in terms of policy design for government programs and so forth. So based on that, one continues to be quite hopeful, including through the work that you are doing, Peter, where I've seen here that there is some interest that has been mentioned around the Kruger National Park, some interest about, around the mining space. These are all the areas that we are working currently, facilitating support for industry players and communities. And I'm hopeful that we will soon be able to share some positive lessons coming out of these spaces. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Mazwi. Thanks, everyone, for making time to attend this.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Peter, I think we have put together good brains, brilliant people. I hope this should not be the last. I would want to engage with this collective at some other level as we move forward. I can see one has a lot to learn from them, but there are many other issues that I think they can assist government and also assist us as politicians to deal with these matters.
Thank you very much, Mtate Musaka, for those kind words. Thanks, everyone, for making time to attend this webinar. I hope that everybody has benefited from these enriching discussions by the panel, and hopefully, as Mtate Musaka has said, this is not the end of it. Hopefully, we can have follow-up engagements, perhaps in different platforms. I would really like to express my gratitude to members of the panel for having really made time to share your thoughts with us. I also want to thank the participants who attended the session. We appreciate your time. We know that you are all busy people. Lastly, I would like to thank the Mail and Guardian team, as well as the Vumelana team, including Tony Elephant, without whom this session would not have been possible. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.